Hello and welcome to this very special episode of the Ideas Factory. I'm Natma. We are all at home. We're all staying safe, but at the same time, we're trying to bring quality discussion to you here at ORF while we are home. And today we're going to look at the changing relationships between countries post-COVID-19, though we are still in the process of dealing with that health emergency. But it's been 100 days since the WHO was first notified of the virus, which is now known as the COVID-19, and we can safely refer to it as those 100 days that changed the world. A lot of things have changed and a lot of things will change geopolitically in the time to come. And this COVID-19 or the pandemic has taken over the world, its politics, its economy like never before. There will be more geopolitical shakeups and the relationships between countries will change economically and diplomatically. And the big questions in today's episodes that we are looking at is India's relationship, especially with the United States, as well as India's relationship with China. And the question that we're asking is, how will India's relationship with China play out in post-COVID-19 times? Will there be shifting of gears? The other question to look at is India's relationship with the US. Will India really relook at the various levels and areas of engagement with the United States after President Trump's style of diplomacy? And will a post-COVID-19 world see a kind of economic nationalism? Also, we will look at, will China suffer from social distancing, global social distancing COVID-19? I have with me Professor Harsh Pant, who is the Director of Studies and Head of Strategic Studies at ORF. Professor Pant, welcome to this episode. And I want to begin by asking you the question regarding India and United States. We've recently seen President Trump in his own style of diplomacy actually threatening India over supplies of HCQ, hydroxychloroquine, which is regarded as a magic drug by some for the treatment of COVID-19. But never before have we seen a head of state talk to another head of state in these many words that if you do not release our supply, there will be retaliation. India, of course, has tried to downplay this as unnecessary controversy. But do you think these things will eventually, when we've all dealt with our health emergency, affect our relationship?
Thank you, Ragma, and welcome once again. I think, as you pointed out, we are all looking at a world which is being reshaped and redefined by the pandemic. And I think all bilateral relationships are also in a bit of a flux at the moment because the larger frame through which they are being assessed, they are being reevaluated, is once again the coronavirus pandemic. So I think the challenge for all countries at the moment is how can they isolate their immediate concerns from the longer term trajectories of their engagement. And in this case, while much has been made out of Mr. Trump's threat, I think there is evidence to suggest, various newspapers have reported that I think India's decision, in fact, was taken much before Mr. Trump came out publicly to release the drug to allow the export of the drug in the international market. And I think Mr. Trump clearly is in a very different category. He does not believe in traditional diplomacy. It has had consequences. He has dealt with his closest allies in a manner in which perhaps you don't even deal with your adversaries. So India perhaps can take some comfort from the fact that after the release of the drug, he has come back and appreciated India's efforts. But I think the larger issue here is what, as a community, international world or the world order can do as a community in dealing with this crisis. And I think that is a message that India has consistently given from the very beginning, which I think is a very important one. That while we look inwards and while we try to frame our national responses to these crises, our respective national responses, major powers, countries that have the capacity should be dealing with at a larger regional or at a global level. And I think, whether you look at India's response by bringing in SAARC countries, by whether you're looking at India's idea that G20 should become the platform to discuss this, we have seen a certain trajectory in India's response, which has related itself to the wider concerns of humanity. And I think that's a good way in some ways. And in this particular case, we also have the problem that India is recognized as the pharmacy of the world, for example. So clearly, our pharmaceutical industry should also be responding to this global challenge in some ways. And whatever evidence we have so far suggests that there is Indian state has taken necessary measures to make sure that we have enough for our domestic requirements, and at the same time reaching out and maintaining its global commitments. And also remember that we are all of this is happening at a time when you yourself mentioned in the beginning that when we look back at the once COVID-19 has settled down a bit, once we look back, we will have to reassess who our friends were, who are and who really came up during the time of crisis, who really stood up with us during the time of crisis. And I think countries will be signaling, and countries continue to signal that even during this crisis, a lot of politics, a lot of politicking has shaped global responses. And perhaps when this crisis abates, countries will be looking back and assessing, how various countries stood with them or against them, and therefore we will end up in a very different environment. So I think India's response to Mr. Trump also reflected that larger understanding that once this crisis is over, where do we want to be with America? And therefore, I think what I could gather was that it was a mature response, it was a sensible response, and I think the official government response has been, as you pointed out, let's not make too much out of this. With clearly, what Mr. Trump says at times, he completely repudiates the next hour. So we are with Mr. Trump, we are in very in a unique trajectory in that sense. But the fact of the matter is that at the end of it, we are back to where we started. We are, both countries and Mr. Trump's tweet and Mr. Modi's response to that tweet underlies that we are clearly looking at dealing with this crisis together. And that's, I think, by and large, a good response given the times we are in.
Of course, I totally agree with what you said. India's response has been very, very mature. But at the same time, Trump's response or Trump's handling of the situation has not been very mature. Where you say that, you qualify by saying that he's in a different trajectory, but also America is facing an election, and a lot of things that he says, or a lot of signaling has been about America first, which he has been doing from the time he assumed office. But right now, again, we see a nationalism, we see a lack of global leadership. It's all about America, not only America, but most of the other countries are doing the same. So we see a rising or an upsurge in nationalism. We will also see economic nationalism probably on the rise. So what are your opinion on that? Because most of the countries are relooking at their over-dependence on China, of how they can be in many areas. I mean, first of all, let's talk of health. How can we cannot say that the countries can be self-sustained, but to reduce the interdependence, all of that. And at the same time, what Mr. Trump is saying and talking and the way things are shaping up in America, there's a lot of chaos right now, but America is facing an election. That has to be also kept in mind.
Absolutely. See, I think Mr. Trump's response to this crisis has been very muddled from the very beginning, as far as the domestic, and clearly he has, his eyes on the November elections. He has been, extremely wishy-washy when the crisis started. In fact, he was planning to open up all the businesses by the Easter weekend, which is this weekend, when he was saying that, look, this is going to be a big weekend. We are going to go out and shop. Clearly not understanding at a very crucial point early on in the crisis, early on in this cycle, that we have entered a very, very critical phase, that America has entered a very, very critical phase. So I think there has been a blowback, there has been a resistance, now there has been great partisan divide we have seen coming up, emerging in America. And that is to be expected, as you point out again, that we are in this election year where every participant is looking at what this might mean for the future of American presidency. And Mr. Trump, perhaps more than anyone else, is very conscious of the fact that perhaps his re-election chances now completely depend on how he frames his response to this crisis. Now, what he has done is, from the very beginning, he was always saying America first. So his big economic message for the last 4 years has been America first, economic nationalism, that we have to rebuild America's strength in critical sectors. And related to that was his harsh stance on China and how America needs to decouple with China. So clearly now we are at a stage where that debate gets accelerated both in America and elsewhere. And we will come to that in a minute about the pharmacy and other critical sectors. But I think for Mr. Trump, it is very important that what he does, during this crisis resonates with his base, resonates with the larger economic message that he has been trying to bring to the table, that he does not contradict his larger message. And I think that's where he has been pretty on message from the very beginning, irrespective of the fact of how it turns out on the ground. So you look the chaos on the ground, you look at how even New York has been unable to handle it, how some of his policy advisors have been moving back and forth in trying to assessing this crisis. It was only when the numbers were put on front of Mr. Trump that he realized the extent of the crisis. 1 week before, he was saying, "Oh, we are, it's a flu. How does it matter? It's like a flu. We have more people dying of flu." And then a week later, when his health team put the numbers out, he actually got the message that there is something really serious going on. So I think there is a larger problem in terms of Mr. Trump's ability to manage and govern this crisis. But much will depend, I think, as like elsewhere, on how he frames it. And therefore, the frame that he's using is economic nationalism. And therefore, the earlier question that we were discussing, the so-called threat to India, was also within that frame. That, you would threaten countries, you would make a case to countries like, look, we will retaliate if you don't do this. And I think that is something that has been part and parcel of his diplomatic style, of his leadership style, and that has been reflected now even during this crisis. Now, whether it works or not, we will come to know over the next few weeks. But I think the larger message that is emanating in terms of economic nationalism, I think that is something that we have to watch out very carefully, because we are increasingly entering in a phase where some of the tendencies that we were witnessing before gets accentuated, where the economic nationalism becomes the hallmark of our times. We have moved far away from the end of history hypothesis of Francis Fukuyama in early 1990s to one where countries are now looking inwards, trying to redefine what their critical sectors are. Remember, Mr. Trump's focus was on critical strategic industries, those industries in particular that are related to Industrial Revolution 4.0, emerging strategic technologies, where he wanted nothing to do with China, where he wanted to build American capabilities. But now we are at a phase where even pharmaceuticals are becoming, will be looked at as a critical sector, and will be looked at and will be assessed in terms of how much leverage countries can bring to bear on the global markets, and what China can and has been able to do, and how it has been able to leverage that influence, that power for geopolitical influence is there for all to see. So we are, I think, in America, India, European Union, all of these countries will be debating and discussing now how do we rebuild our strength, how do we rebuild our manufacturing base, especially even in areas where I think till a few weeks back, there was no discussion. So we did not realize how critical, many amongst us did not realize how critical pharmaceuticals can be when such a pandemic emerges as a critical security threat. And now we are missing that, and I think that debate is going to go forward. So economic nationalism is here to stay, is going to be much more widespread, and we are going to see consequences playing out over the next few months and years.
So, Professor Pant, when you spoke of the critical industries where nations will relook at what are the critical industries. But right now, do you think this will also spill over to 5G telecommunication? It's not just about health, because after all, what is now being reinforced is that there is a trust issue. It's about transparency. The way China was lacking in trust and transparency is for everyone to see. And most of the countries are now relooking at how they will deal with China. The US President has signed an executive order which will further restrict Chinese investment in the US telecommunications sector. So this was another milestone in the US decoupling with China. We are, in a way, we will also look at this spilling over in this sector, the 5G, the telecommunications.
Yes, Nagma, and I think it was already happening before this crisis emerged. Our 5G debate was being shaped by our traditional security concerns vis-a-vis China, and many other countries also were looking at it. For example, there was a vigorous debate in countries like Australia, Britain, other countries in Europe, and of course in America. in America. And I think now what China has done during this crisis, how China has behaved, and this complete lack of transparency in the initial days will lead people to a set of conclusions that perhaps it will be much more harsher, much stronger vis-a-vis what China actually brings to the table. And 5G becomes one aspect of one instrumentality which is going to be severely affected as far as China is concerned. And I think most countries that would be looking at this debate would be looking at the issue of 5G, would be looking at using Huawei, for example, for the 5G connectivity. We'll have to reassess now how far the issue of transparency affects when you have an issue like health, where you would in normal circumstances you would have expected greater transparency. Look, this is not a traditional security matter. Health is something that affects us all. Health is something that a country like China should have been very aware is going to impact the entire globe very quickly. And yet, the lack of transparency from China was absolutely mind-boggling. Yes. And so clearly now, when you're looking at strategic sectors, and when you were looking at 5G now going forward, countries will have to make very strong assessments of how far they can trust China. And I think that is a larger question for the international community now to answer.
Yeah, and Trump, of course, has accused the WHO of being China-centric, and it's not an accusation which is, it's quite a well-founded accusation, because we've all seen the tilt towards China in the functioning of WHO and the way WHO, put out its recommendations and all of that. But having said that, now let's look at China and India. There is a lot of anger on the streets in India, like amongst the common people, where people feel that what they are going through now, what they're suffering now, is because of China. It's though India has refrained from calling it the China virus, which President Trump clearly he uses it again and again and calls it the China virus. India is not doing that. Nevertheless, people here are upset. There's anger on the street that China has let down the world, and WHO in any case has been biased towards China. So do we see the relationship, there's a reset after the COVID-19 pandemic is done with, the way we will deal with China, because the two countries have by now learned to be comfortable with each other. There is, of course, competitiveness in economic sectors, in the regional areas, in terms of regional security. But will there be, or how will the relationship play out? Having seen all this, the trust and the mistrust and the anger, and China being blamed for the pandemic and not responding quickly to contain it.
Yeah, I think this is quite I think interesting, because officially India has of course continues to maintain its solidarity with China, and China continues to say nice things about India, the problem in India, in April 1st was also we were celebrating 70 years of diplomatic relations with China. So there is a historical trajectory to where China and India are today. But I think clearly there is a perception which I think China cannot get away with, Chinese Communist Party cannot get away with. And this is not simply on the Indian streets, it's almost everywhere. You see a public perception being generated of how China has not only been less transparent in the initial in the initial phase of this crisis, but has also since then been manipulating international institutions to its advantage, and has been using this crisis for geopolitical advantage. You have a whole host of issues there. So for India in particular, therefore, the issue becomes very critical for Indian leadership, I think, because Indian leadership clearly would like to keep the relations on an even keel, but public perception is becoming very, very negative. And the fact that India and other countries are having to suffer this crisis and without any accountability being asked of China is something that will be raised more and more once the immediate crisis subsides. And I think it will be very difficult for Indian leadership to pretend that the relationship can continue as is. And I think a lot of the issues that we have discussed, whether it is about making sure that our dependence declines on China, even on pharmaceuticals, for example, where we are looking at APIs, where we are dependent on China for raw materials and APIs, this is something that we have to rethink. If this is an industry, if another pandemic happens, and we don't want this kind of over-reliance on China. So clearly, one aspect of our engagement which has been positive over the years has been trade. I think that is likely to suffer going forward, and which makes me worried about the future trajectory of this relationship. Because trade was one factor that was in a relationship that had very many negative factors. Trade was one positive. If trade becomes a factor which we'll have to rethink, or which we are being forced to rethink now, I think the future trajectory looks rather gloomy to me.
You're saying the future trajectory looks rather gloomy, because we've seen, first, we're all talking of economic nationalism, but we've seen also the economic interdependence. Beijing protested against India's ban on travelers from China in early February, and it is reported to have delayed clearance of Indian evacuation flight to land in Wuhan. And now New Delhi's medical assistance to China during the peak of the crisis in Wuhan wasn't publicly acknowledged. So many things, and we are still getting our supplies of PPEs and ventilators from China. All this is happening. We've all talked of, have seen the Wuhan reset when PM Modi and Xi Jinping met. But Wuhan, of course, in near foreseeable future will be now remembered for other things. So do you think there will be a reset after this, or where are we right now vis-a-vis our relationship with China?
I think at the moment, of course, we have very immediate concerns about how to deal with the COVID-19 crisis. We have immediate concerns about where do we get our kit from, and that is a problem that every country has faced. Look, Spain, France, Italy, all of these countries have been having troubles and have accused China of not being transparent. But at the same time, given their dependence on China for medical supplies and medical kits, they have gone to China. We have also done the same. But I think once the crisis abates, immediate problems abate, we'll have to rethink whether this kind of reliance is good, whether we need some kind of domestic availability of these kits, of these supplies, whether we want to build our manufacturing base. We've talked about for a long time now, but we have shied away from doing that. So clearly, I think we are at an inflection point, as you pointed out at the very beginning, and a lot of these decisions would be based on what has happened over the last few months and weeks.
Yes, and a very quick comment on the SAARC region. On India's role. India has taken initiatives we've seen in very early on, but now, especially vis-a-vis Pakistan, how do you look at that?
I think that, again, one would like to believe that when there is a crisis of this kind, politics ideally should take a back seat, but I don't think that has happened. And clearly, a lot of the responses of states are still being framed by the larger political goals, as in the case of China that we were talking about. But even, for example, we look at Pakistan's case here. Here was a case, here was a cause which could have brought South Asia together, and we have seen repeated Pakistani efforts to make it seem as if this is something about India Pakistan. This is very political. The SAARC conference that Prime Minister had convened, the Pakistani representative was interested more on Kashmir, talking more about Kashmir than anything else. So I think there are issues there, and now, of course, Pakistan has wanted SAARC Secretariat to be the routing mechanism for doing anything around this crisis, which India has objected to. And there is, of course, the delay in Pakistan's aid, the COVID contribution to the COVID aid package, that SAARC aid package that Prime Minister had mooted. So clearly, I think countries are still, even during this time of crisis, responding with keeping their political antennas intact. That I don't think that has been very beneficial, because the crisis of this magnitude requires a degree of magnanimity, which perhaps nation states find it very difficult to get rid of or to showcase even at these critical times. But my sense is that irrespective of what Pakistan continues to do or does not do with regard to SAARC, my sense is that other countries in South Asia have clearly will have to work together, because the kinds of borders we have and the crisis is not going anywhere anytime soon. So there is a long way off, and the countries will have to work together with each other, both in building institutional capacity as well as in helping each other out with whatever limited capacities they have.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. A very important point there to end this discussion on is about the magnanimity that you talked of. That's what we expect from global leaders and big countries, but that has been clearly lacking. Not only that, but global leadership also has been lacking, and it's been said that the only way to prevent future pandemic is to increase global cooperation and not lessen it, and in also to strengthen the international institutes. And they should have received more support, but we've seen how things have played out, and the world seems to be moving in the opposite direction with more protectionism and nationalism worldwide. Thank you so much, Professor Pant, for that discussion and joining us here on Ideas Factory. Thank you all very much.